one of the most fascinating people, in my opinion, after Jesus in the Bible is the Apostle Paul. He wrote over half of the New Testament. Paul did more to spread Christianity to the world than anyone of his time. Looking online and looking through libraries, I can't find a biography for Paul. I can find one for war heroes, for politicians, for musicians, for actors. Can't find a biography for one of the most fascinating and influential people that's ever walked on the earth. So this evening, I'm going to try to create a biography for the Apostle Paul. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to refer to some of my notes because I'm not as good a teacher. Steve said I'm supposed to make him look good. I don't think there's going to be any problem with that. So first, who was Paul? Let's get to know him. A biography of Paul, I think, would start out like, Paul was born Saul. That was his Hebrew name. It's pronounced Shaul. Probably after the biblical King Saul, to honor King Saul. Paul's other name that we know him by is Paul, which in the Greek is Paulus, means small. We don't know if Paul was small of stature. He was definitely not a small man. Paul was a great man. But some authors have said, I don't necessarily agree with them, but some of them have said that it was typical for Jews of that time to have two names. One Hebrew, one either Latin or Greek. Now, I can't find a biblical direction on this, so, we can only speculate, which is all they're doing. First mention of Paul we have is in Acts 7:58, and the witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet whose name was Saul. So that being said, we know Saul was born approximately in 5 AD, some say as early as 5 BC, and died 65 to 66 AD during the reign of Nero, when Nero finally went off the deep end. Like I said, in Acts 13:9, he's first called Paul. Paul spoke what they called fluent Greek or Hellenistic Greek, Koine Greek they call it, the common dialect, which was what he used to write his letters. His first language was probably Hebrew, which he spoke in his home, and would have been spoken while he was studying with Gamaliel as he addressed the crowd. Remember in Acts 22, where he addressed the crowd in their own language. And he probably spoke Greek and Hebrew growing up, as his family was Jewish in a Roman city. He was from a devout Jewish family based in the city of Tarsus, which had been made part of the Roman province of Cilicia. By the time of Paul's adulthood, Tarsus was one of the larger centers of trade on the Mediterranean coast and renowned for its academy. It had been among the most influential cities in Asia Minor. Paul referred to himself as being of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee. The Bible reveals very little about Paul's family. Acts quotes Paul as referring to his family. The only thing refers to his family where he talks about his sister's son, his nephew, in Acts 23:16. He refers to Timothy and Titus as his sons, not necessarily by birth, but by meaning they were followers of his, teaching and fellow evangelists helping him spread the gospel throughout the new churches. Paul's trade was a tent maker. Everybody had a tent back then. This was a nomadic life. Everybody traveled, whether they were traveling from their home to the temple, traveling for commerce. Everybody traveled. Kind of like today where everybody, well, not everybody has an RV, but a lot of people have an RV. There were no Holiday Inns back then. You had to have a tent. That would be akin to, like I said, an RV maker today or a home builder today. A lot of people didn't have homes. They lived in tents. So Saul was a tent maker, and what we understand was probably one of the finest tent makers. If his trade was anything like his ministry, probably one of the best tents you could buy. It'd be what is today, the Eddie Bauer of tents. While he was fairly young, he was sent to Jerusalem to receive his education at the school of Gamaliel, who was one of the most noticed teachers of Jewish law in history. Modern scholarship accepts that Paul was educated under the supervision of Gamaliel in Jerusalem. It doesn't seem that he was preparing though, to become a teacher of the law. More seems like he was trying to be a member of the Sanhedrin as a Pharisee. He never had contact with the Hillelite school, which at that time would be like modern day theological seminaries are, where you would go to study to become a rabbi or a teacher. We feel that he wanted to be in power in the Sanhedrin as a Pharisee, as he said he was from a family of Pharisees. And since his family resided in Jerusalem, since later we know his nephew saved his life, there's not a whole lot more known about his biography. And like I said, the first we hear of him is in Acts 7:58, when he takes an active part in the martyrdom of Stephen. Funny story, my wife's brother, they were studying Stephen. He was about 5 years old. They were studying Stephen in church one day, and the preacher was talking about how they'd stoned Stephen. He goes, "They didn't either." Some modern scholarship agrees that while Paul was fluent in Koine Greek, I can't even read my own writing sometimes, Hellenistic Greek, the common dialect, but his first language was probably Hebrew. Now we know about the conversion of Saul on the road to Damascus. Acts 3 and 9, 3 through 9. And he journeyed, and he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined about him a light from heaven. He fell to the earth, and he heard a voice saying unto him, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?" And he said, "Who art thou, Lord?" And the Lord said, "I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks." And he, trembling and astonished, said, "Lord, what will you have me do?" The Lord said unto him, "Arise, go into the city, and it will be told what you must do." And the men he journeyed with stood speechless. They heard a voice, but saw no man. Saul arose and was led into the city. And there he spent 3 days without sight, neither did he eat or drink. Many people have speculated what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. We know Paul was a prideful man. He talked about his pride. I tend to take the word thorn in the flesh literally. I think Paul's thorn in the flesh was cataracts. We know that cataracts can be quite painful. Back then they didn't know what they were. It was your eyes started hurting, you started going blind. A note in my studies found in Galatians 6:11, it points out, "Look at what large letters I write to you. I take that meaning he was losing his sight by then. A lot of his letters close with the citation written by such and such. I think he dictated those letters because he was blind, couldn't see to write anymore. Galatians 4 and 15, he writes, "Where is then the blessedness you spoke of? For I bear you record that if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and have given them to me." Cataracts can be caused by an injury to the eye, prolonged exposure to the sun, staring straight into the sun, welding. I used to weld. I'll probably end up with cataracts. I knew I was going to do that. Cataracts. And like I said, back then, there wasn't any operation. Now you can go get an operation, they take care of them. Wasn't pain pills back then. Like I said, I've understood they were quite painful. Thinking when he was blinded on the road to Damascus and he received his sight in the home of Judas in Damascus, there fell as there were scales from his eyes. I take that to mean that a layer of the cornea came off. When the cornea grows back, it's thicker and can end up being quite painful, cause blindness. I've got a young man that I've been mentoring. Hopefully I'm doing it properly. He asked me the question here a while back, which got me started thinking, what made Paul an apostle? I was like, okay, let's start studying. What did make Paul an apostle? Jesus made Paul an apostle. He said, well, how do you know that? So we started finding scripture and reference to find that out. First, we defined an apostle. So what is an apostle? It's from the Greek apostolos, meaning one who is sent out. Dictionary.com describes an apostle any of the early followers of Jesus who carried the Christian message into the world. In the Bible, any of the 12 disciples called by Jesus to preach the gospel. Webster's Dictionary defines it as one sent on a mission, such as one of an authoritative New Testament group sent out to preach the gospel and made up especially of Christ's 12 original disciples. You can't see it, I dropped it off. And also Paul, says that in the dictionary. The first prominent Christian missionary to a region or a group. A person who initiates a great moral reform or who first advocates an important system of belief. Paul was one of the first people that brought Christianity to a lot of the churches in the Gentile world. Or an ardent supporter. Nobody can say Paul was not an ardent supporter. I looked up in the Oxford Dictionary what the definition was, and it read like stereo instructions from IKEA in Swedish. I didn't bother. Encyclopedia Britannica gives a very good definition. An apostle, from the Greek apostolos, meaning person sent. Any of the 12 disciples chosen by Jesus. The term is sometimes also applied to others, especially Paul, who was converted to Christianity a few years after Jesus' death. In Luke 6:13, it states that Jesus chose 12 from his disciples, whom he named apostles. In Mark 6:30, the 12 were also called apostles when mention is made of them on their return from preaching and healing, which Jesus had sent them. We all know who the 12 apostles are. Mark 3, Matthew 10, and Luke 6. We know that Simon, who was called Peter, Andrew, his brother, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew the tax collector, Thomas, the doubting one, James, the son of Alphaeus, Judas or Thaddeus, as he was called, was the son of James, Simon the Canaanite, is also referred to as Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. The privileges of the 12 were to be in continual attendance to their master and be the recipients of his special teaching and training. And at least once they were sent on a special mission, 2 by 2, to announce the imminence of the Messianic kingdom. We know that Peter, James, and John formed an inner circle who alone were permitted to witness such events as the raising of Jairus' daughter, the transfiguration, and the agony of Jesus in the garden. And special importance seems to have been attached to the number 12, which some scholars interpret as a reference to the 12 tribes, honoring the 12 tribes, because when a gap had been left by Judas, the traitor, they immediately acted to fill that hole with the election of Matthias. As members of this band of 12, the word apostle usually applies to in Acts. Paul himself claimed the role of apostle.
There was also another one that took Jesus' place, Matthias.
Right. I missed that note. I was hoping you wouldn't catch that. You did. Paul himself claimed the title of apostle, apparently on the grounds that he had seen the risen Lord and received a commission directly from him. Now this appears to be in agreement with the condition in Acts that a newly appointed apostle should be capable of giving eyewitness testimony to the Lord's resurrection. According to some early Christian writers, however, some were called apostles after the period covered by the New Testament. Some denominations use the word apostle to designate a high administrative or ecclesiastical author. I think Catholics use that. Luke 6 and 13, and when it was day, he called unto him his disciples, and of them he chose 12, whom he named apostles. 6:1, Jesus left there and went to his hometown accompanied by his disciples. Verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. So the text uses the term apostle and disciple to describe the followers of the 12. Like I said, they mentioned Jesus and the preaching and teaching which he had sent them. So what is a disciple then, we ask? Well, let's look up a disciple. Dictionary.com says a person who is a pupil or an adherent of the doctrines of another from a religious standpoint. One of the 12 personal followers of Christ. One of the 70 followers sent forth by Christ, as in Luke 10 and 1. Any other professed follower of Christ in his lifetime, or any follower of Christ. Doesn't that make us all disciples? We all follow Christ. Miss Webster's, is it Mrs. Webster? Does anybody know? Marion Webster? I don't know. One who accepts and assists in spreading the doctrines of another, such as Christianity. One of the 12 of the inner circle of Christ's followers, according to the Gospels, are convinced adherent of a school or an individual. So that's what makes a disciple. The term disciple has become so common after 2,000 years of Christian history that many never think about what it actually meant in Jesus' time. So where did this term originally come from? Remember, the New Testament was written mostly in Greek. The Greek word we translate into English as disciple is mathetes. Our word disciple comes from the Latin equivalent of that word, discipulus. These days, some might be considered a disciple, a follower of any charismatic leaders. Follow a Jones, a Koresh, any of those. They had their disciples. I'm using that term loosely, very loosely. But the New The word was used before the New Testament, though another translation suggests itself as a student.
Yeah, it's interesting about disciple because in Mark 16, Jesus told them to baptize people and call to make disciples. He didn't say make Christians.
Right.
He said make disciples.
Mm-hmm.
So actually the kingdom of Christ is disciples.
Right.
You know, and there's a sect of the restored truth that call themselves disciples of Christ because of that.
Right.
Today. Even.
Yeah.
You know, so they were called Christians later, as it mentioned in Acts, but you know, and we stuck with that term.
Exactly.
Because
Exactly.
it mentions Christ, which made it a little bit more fitting.
Right. You're exactly right. Like I said, another word for disciple would be student. A diligent student. In Greek, they would be the student of a philosopher, possibly. Clearly, a disciple was not simply someone who just listened to lectures either. Read the writings of a philosopher. They lived day to day with their teacher, following the teacher's examples, in some ways actually trying to become a living reflection of the teacher. That describes the 12 apostles to a T right there. And this seemed appropriate to call them disciples, and then for him to make them apostles. Back to Paul. We know that Paul studied, as some say, under Gamaliel. I looked up King James and New King James says studying at the feet of Gamaliel. The NIV and the ESV words it as studying under Gamaliel. Maybe just semantics, but I think it's the same thing. He was studying the law so that he could become in the Sanhedrin, a Pharisee of the law, a judge of the law. Now, for the original disciples, it's clear from the writings in the four Gospels that the 12 were with Jesus day in and day out, learning from him, attempting to imitate his way of life, where Paul was not. We understand the difference between a disciple and an apostle now. Which one was Paul? Or was he both? Why do we use the term Paul the apostle and not Paul the disciple? Called the definition, the disciple is a student or of a philosopher or religious teacher. Before his crucifixion, Jesus had 12 disciples. They lived with him day to day, listened to his teachings, and mostly initiated his way of life, imitated his way of life. Being a disciple, in definition, involved living with the teacher. That couldn't describe Paul. Paul never really met Jesus before he was crucified. Well, in fact, he never met Jesus before he was crucified that we know of. Well, he became undoubtedly a follower of Jesus. He wasn't born or raised in Israel like Jesus and his disciples. He never met the earthly Jesus and didn't claim to have met the earthly Jesus. However, Paul believed he had met the resurrected Jesus, the one who had been killed and raised, exalted, and vindicated by God. Paul doesn't say much about this meeting, although in Acts, Luke describes some of it. It's a dramatic scene depicted in many famous paintings of Paul's conversion, meeting Jesus. He's blinded, recovers his sight, and believed Jesus commissioned him to preach to the Gentiles. Now, Paul does describe a mythical experience he had, which could be the same experience. This seems to have been a private encounter, one that could not be verified by other people. In fact, he says, 2 Corinthians 12, 2 and 4, that he's not even sure whether it was a physical experience or not. Could someone read 2 Corinthians 12, 2 and 4.
I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise. He heard inexpressible things that man is not permitted to tell.
So it seems to me he doesn't know whether he was having an out-of-body experience or whether he actually saw with his own eyes. His real feelings about this mission, about his mission, are often encapsulated in the greetings of his undisputed letters, like the one in Galatians 1:1, Paul, an apostle, not of men, neither by man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. Note that Paul says he was not an apostle, not of man, but by the risen Jesus directly. A little later, Galatians 1:15 and 17, he elaborates on what Jesus sent him to do. But when the one who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who are already apostles before me. Paul says that the risen God chose him directly to preach the gospel of Jesus to the Gentiles, which is why he travels throughout the Roman Empire, starting Jesus-following communities and writing letters to them addressing their problems and questions. Is this why Paul called himself an apostle? Could be. And not a disciple, because as he knew, he never met Jesus.
And further along in that chapter there, it shows that Paul, before he began his teaching, spent some considerable time with somebody, 3 years as a matter of fact,
Yes.
before he started preaching.
Yes.
And he spent some of that time in Damascus, and he went to Arabia, wherever that was, nobody knows.
Right.
My personal opinion, he was self-taught by Jesus like all the apostles.
I tend to agree with that.
3 years.
3 years. There's that magic number 3 that we see in Christianity a lot, but for 3 years, I believe Paul studied with the risen Jesus to learn the gospel, to learn salvation.
It's an implication, it's not valid.
I tend to agree with that. But there was a lot of other early Christians that didn't believe Paul was an apostle. Who were those? He makes his same argument for his apostleship several times in his undisputed letters. He makes that clear in 1 Corinthians 9, 1 and 2. Could someone read that?
Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. 3 also. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we have no right to eat and drink?
Very good argument. Makes a very good argument right there. But like I said, there were some that didn't think Paul was an apostle. 2 Corinthians 11, 22, and 23, he calls them super apostles. He refers to them, reads in the NIV, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm out of my mind to talk like this. I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more, frequently been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. Paul makes some very good arguments, but it's clear some Jewish apostles claimed that Paul was not a valid apostle. Why? I feel that it's probably because, unlike the 12 original disciples, Paul didn't know the earthly Jesus. So ultimately, we don't know.
I think it's also because he was teaching to the Gentiles primarily.
I do too. That makes a...
Jews had a hard time accepting that.
Yes. So I believe we answered the question. Paul is an apostle. So to wrap it up, a lot of histories say that Paul was martyred in Rome sometime around 65 AD. It had to be before 68 AD, which was the end of Nero's reign. It's when Nero finally went off the deep end, was killing anyone that he felt was a threat to his position and power. He was playing into the hands of the Jews in Rome, who had become a very powerful lobby. So, in that conclusion of Paul's biography, wait, there's more. Made me think of something Mac mentioned in a class here a while back, the Apostles' Doctrine. I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what the actual wording was. I don't know if any of you know the actual wording of what the Apostles' Doctrine is. I looked it up. The body of teaching, practices, and standards of conduct given and established by the apostles of the Lord Jesus Christ to the disciples in the early church. Wouldn't that also include Paul's letters?
Yeah, the concourse of all the writings.
Exactly. That's one of the strongest arguments right there I have for Paul validly is an apostle.
Yeah, over 13 or maybe 14 books.
Exactly. Almost over half of the New Testament. Sorry, when I put this together, I was expecting Jeff to be here. This was before, since he was studying Greek. Thank y'all. Thank you very much. Hopefully it made some sense.